I used to believe that motherhood was a permanent contract, one written in sleepless nights, signed in tears of joy, and sealed with unconditional love. For 28 years, I lived by that belief. I was Martha Morrison, the woman who would move mountains for her son Lucas, who would sacrifice everything to see him succeed, who would stand between him and the world if necessary. But I was wrong about permanence. I learned that love, no matter how deep, no matter how pure, can become inconvenient to the people you love most. It started on his wedding night. I should have known from the way Isabella looked at me during the ceremony, not with the warmth you'd expect toward your new mother-in-law, but with the cold calculation of someone measuring an obstacle. Her smile was perfect for the cameras, but her eyes told a different story when they found mine. They said, "You don't belong in his future." I had spent months preparing for that wedding. I'd saved every penny from my part-time job at the library to buy Lucas the watch his father never gave him, a gold timepiece engraved with, "To my beloved son, with endless love, Mom." I imagined him wearing it on his wedding day, carrying a piece of my heart with him as he started his new life. But as I approached him in those precious moments before the ceremony, Isabella intercepted me with surgical precision. "Oh, Martha," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "That's so thoughtful. But Lucas already has a watch. From my father. Family tradition, you understand." She didn't need to say the rest. The message was clear. I wasn't family anymore. Not the kind that mattered. I watched my son exchange vows with a woman who had already begun erasing me from his story. When the officiant spoke about leaving and cleaving, about honoring parents while building new families, I saw Lucas's eyes dart toward Isabella, seeking her approval even in that sacred moment. He was already choosing. The reception was a masterpiece of polite exclusion. I sat at a table with distant relatives who barely knew my name, while Isabella's family commanded the head table with the easy confidence of people who belonged. Every toast, every speech, every moment of celebration seemed designed to highlight my irrelevance in this new chapter of Lucas's life. When I finally found a moment to speak with him, my boy who used to curl up in my lap during thunderstorms, who used to save his drawings from school to show me first, he was surrounded by Isabella's friends, laughing at jokes I couldn't hear. I waited at the edge of their circle like a stranger seeking an audience. "Lucas," I said when the laughter died down, "could I speak with you for just a moment?" The silence that followed felt endless. His friends looked at me with barely concealed irritation, as if I had interrupted something important. Isabella appeared beside him with the territorial instincts of a woman marking her domain. "Mom," he said, and something in his tone made my heart sink. There was distance in that word, a formality that hadn't existed even that morning. "Can't it wait? We're in the middle of something." I looked at my son, this man I had raised alone after his father walked away, this person I had sacrificed everything to nurture and protect, and I saw a stranger, someone who could dismiss his mother on his wedding night as casually as he might wave away a waitress. "I just wanted to give you your gift," I whispered, holding out the small wrapped box that contained months of my savings and years of my love. Isabella's laugh was like broken glass. "Oh, another gift! Lucas, you're going to need a storage unit." The way she said "another" made it clear that my offering was just more clutter in their perfect new life. Lucas took the box without looking at it, without the excitement he used to show for even the smallest surprises. "Thanks, Mom. I'll open it later." Later. Everything was later now. His time, his attention, his love, all deferred to some vague future moment that somehow never arrived. I stood there in my carefully chosen dress, the one I'd bought on sale 3 months earlier, the navy blue that Lucas had once said brought out my eyes, and felt myself becoming invisible. The conversations flowed around me like water around a stone, and I realized that I was no longer part of the current of his life. "Martha!" Isabella's voice cut through my thoughts with false enthusiasm. "You must be so proud. Lucas has told me so much about how you raised him all by yourself. That must have been challenging." The way she said "challenging" made it sound like a failure rather than an accomplishment, as if being a single mother was something shameful, something that required pity rather than respect. Around us, her friends nodded with the sympathetic smiles people reserve for life's unfortunate circumstances. "It was the greatest privilege of my life," I said quietly, looking at Lucas as I spoke. For just a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition, maybe. or memory. But then Isabella's hand found his arm, and whatever connection we'd shared was severed. Well, Isabella continued with that practiced smile, thank goodness he found his way to success despite everything. Right, honey? Despite everything. Despite me. Despite the woman who had worked 2 jobs to pay for his college, who had driven him to every baseball practice and piano lesson, who had stayed up all night helping him with homework and soothing his fears and celebrating his victories. If you like emotional stories, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment which city you're watching from. That night, after the last dance had been danced and the last guest had gone home, I drove back to my small apartment alone. The wedding gift sat unopened on my kitchen table, still wrapped in paper that suddenly seemed childish and naive. I had believed that love was enough, that the bond between a mother and son was unbreakable. I was about to learn how wrong I could be. As I sat in the silence of my empty home, surrounded by photographs of a little boy who used to think I hung the moon, I heard my phone buzz with a text message. For a moment, my heart leaped. Maybe Lucas was reaching out. Maybe he wanted to thank me for everything. Maybe the distance I'd felt was just wedding day stress. The message was from Isabella. Thank you for respecting our space today. Lucas needs time to focus on his new family now. I'm sure you understand. I stared at that message until the words blurred together, until the screen went dark and showed me only my own reflection. A 53-year-old woman whose life's work had just been dismissed by someone who had known her son for 2 years. That was the night I realized that sometimes the people you love most are the ones who hurt you deepest. Not with malice, not with cruelty, but with something far worse. Indifference. The silence in my apartment felt different that night. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of solitude. It was the hollow echo of abandonment. I had spent 28 years believing that mothers were irreplaceable. I was about to discover how replaceable I actually was. The weeks following the wedding felt like watching a slow-motion car crash. Every day brought new evidence that I was being systematically erased from Lucas's life, but it happened so gradually, so politely, that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. The first sign came 3 days after they returned from their honeymoon in Italy. I had called to ask how the trip went, the way any mother would. The phone rang 6 times before Lucas answered, and I could hear Isabella's voice in the background. Not the words, but the tone. Sharp, controlling. "Hi, Mom," he said. But there was something strained in his voice, like he was reading from a script he didn't particularly want to perform. "I just wanted to hear about your trip," I said, settling into the chair where I used to spend hours talking to him when he was in college, when he would call every Sunday without fail to tell me about his classes, his friends, his dreams. "It was great," he said, the words coming out flat and rehearsed. "Really great. Listen, Mom, I can't talk long. We're still unpacking and getting settled." Unpacking. They had been home for 3 days. How long did it take to unpack suitcases from a 1-week trip? "Of course, honey. I just missed talking to you. Maybe we could have dinner this weekend. I could make your favorite—" "Actually," he interrupted, and I heard movement in the background, the sound of a door closing. "Actually, Mom, we're pretty busy getting into our routine. Maybe we should plan something for next month instead." Next month. The son who used to drop by my apartment unannounced just to raid my refrigerator was now scheduling me like a dentist appointment. "Oh," I said, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "Well, whenever works for you. You know I'm always here." There was a pause that lasted too long. "I know, Mom. I'll call you soon, okay?" But he didn't call soon. Days turned into weeks, and the silence stretched between us like a canyon that seemed to widen every time I tried to bridge it. I started finding excuses to drive past their house, a beautiful 2-story colonial in the suburbs that Isabella's father had helped them purchase. I would tell myself I was just in the neighborhood, just curious about how they were settling in. But really, I was looking for signs of life, evidence that my son still existed in the world. Their lawn was always perfect, manicured with the precision of people who had both time and money to spend on appearances. Isabella's car, a sleek silver BMW that her parents had given her as a wedding gift, sat in the driveway like a statement about the kind of people they had become. Lucas's old Honda, the one I had helped him buy when he graduated from college, was nowhere to be seen. The windows of their house glowed warmly in the evenings, and sometimes I would catch glimpses of movement inside. Once I saw Lucas pass by the kitchen window, and my heart leaped with such ridiculous hope that I almost got out of the car to knock on the door. But then Isabella appeared beside him, her hand on his shoulder in a gesture that seemed less affectionate than possessive, and I drove away feeling like a stalker in my own son's life. When my birthday arrived in October, the same birthday Lucas had never forgotten, not once in 28 years, I woke up expecting the phone to ring. I had always been an early riser, but that morning I stayed in bed until 9, then 10, then 11, waiting for the call that would prove I hadn't been completely forgotten. By noon, I was sitting at my kitchen table staring at my phone, willing it to ring. I made myself lunch, but the food tasted like cardboard. I turned on the television, but the cheerful voices of daytime show hosts felt like mockery. I cleaned my apartment twice, folding and refolding the same towels just to keep my hands busy. At 6 o'clock, I finally broke down and called him. The phone went straight to voicemail, and Lucas's recorded voice, so familiar yet somehow distant, asked me to leave a message. "Hi, honey," I said, my voice sounding artificially bright even to my own ears. "I just wanted to, well, I thought maybe you'd forgotten what day it is. It's okay if you're busy. I miss you. Call me when you can." He never called back. 2 days later, I received a card in the mail, one of those generic birthday cards you buy in a rush from a drugstore, with a pre-printed message about wishing someone happiness. Inside, Isabella's neat handwriting said, "Hope you had a lovely birthday, Lucas and Isabella." Not even his own handwriting, not even his own words. My son's love had been outsourced to his wife's sense of social obligation. I held that card for a long time, studying every curve of Isabella's letters, looking for some hidden message, some sign that Lucas had at least been involved in choosing it. But there was nothing. Just the efficient execution of a duty by someone who saw me as an item on her to-do list. The holidays were approaching, and I clung to the hope that tradition would bring us back together. Lucas and I had always decorated my Christmas tree together, a ritual that started when he was 6 years old and continued even through his college years. Every ornament had a story. Every string of lights held memories of laughter and hot chocolate, and the simple joy of being together. I called in early November to ask about our usual date. "Christmas plans?" Lucas said, as if the concept was foreign to him. "Oh, Mom, we're actually going to Isabella's parents' house in Connecticut this year. They have this big family tradition. What about our tradition?" I asked, and immediately regretted how desperate I sounded. Another pause. Another conversation I couldn't hear but could feel happening in the background. "Maybe we can do something after Christmas," he said, "when things settle down." When things settle down. Everything was always going to happen when things settled down, but they never did. There was always another reason, another obligation, another priority that didn't include me. I spent Christmas alone for the first time in 29 years. I bought a small tree and decorated it by myself, hanging ornaments that Lucas and I had made together over the years, construction paper angels from his kindergarten years, handprint reindeer from elementary school photos in glittery frames. Each decoration was a ghost of Christmas past, a reminder of a relationship that had apparently expired without my notification. On Christmas morning, I found a gift on my doorstep, clearly purchased online and delivered by a service. Inside the elegant wrapping was a generic spa gift basket, the kind of impersonal present you give to someone you don't really know. The card read, "Merry Christmas, Mom. Love, Lucas and Isabella." Love. Such a small word to carry such enormous weight and such profound emptiness. I sat in my living room surrounded by the debris of my solitary Christmas morning, the beautiful wrapping paper that couldn't disguise the hollowness of the gesture, the gift basket full of products I would never use because they smelled like pity and obligation, and I finally understood what was happening. I wasn't being actively rejected. That would have been honest, clean, something I could fight against or at least understand. Instead, I was being managed, handled, reduced to a problem that needed to be solved with minimal effort and maximum efficiency. Isabella had turned my relationship with my son into a customer service issue, and Lucas was letting her do it. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't about space or adjustment or the natural evolution of family relationships. This was about replacement. Isabella wasn't just Lucas's wife. She was his new mother, his new family, his new everything, and there was no room in their perfectly curated life for the woman who had raised him. I looked around my apartment, at the photos of Lucas that covered every surface, at the artwork he had made me over the years, at the life I had built entirely around being his mother, and I saw it all differently. Not as a shrine to our love, but as evidence of my own pathetic inability to build an identity beyond motherhood. That night, I sat in the dark and cried until I had no tears left. I cried for the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during storms. I cried for the teenager who trusted me with his secrets. I cried for the young man who used to thank me for everything, who used to say I was the strongest person he knew. But mostly, I cried for myself, for the woman who had given everything to someone who now acted like she had never existed at all. The silence in my apartment wasn't just quiet anymore. It was the sound of a life that had lost its purpose, a love that had nowhere left to go. Spring arrived with its usual promise of renewal, but for me, it felt like mockery. While the world around me bloomed with new life, I was withering in ways I hadn't thought possible. 6 months had passed since the wedding, and I had become a stranger in my own son's life. I decided to try one more time. Lucas's birthday was approaching, May 15th, the day I had celebrated with more joy than my own birthday for 29 years. Surely this would be different. Surely he wouldn't let his birthday pass without wanting to see the woman who had brought him into this world. I spent weeks planning. I researched restaurants, made reservations, even bought him a gift. A book about architecture that I knew he would love, signed by an author he admired. I practiced what I would say when I called, rehearsing casual phrases that wouldn't sound desperate or needy. When I finally dialed his number, my hands were shaking like a teenager calling her first crush. "Hi, Mom," he said, and for a moment, I heard an echo of warmth in his voice. Maybe I had been wrong about everything. Maybe the distance had just been stress from the new marriage, adjustment period, normal growing pains. "Lucas, honey, I was hoping we could celebrate your birthday together this year. Just the two of us, like old times. I found this wonderful restaurant downtown." "Actually, Mom," he interrupted, and I heard that familiar sound in the background. Isabella's voice, sharp and immediate. "Actually, we already have plans. Isabella organized a dinner party. All our friends will be there." Our friends. Not his friends. Their friends. People I had never met, would never meet, who probably didn't even know I existed. "Oh," I said, swallowing the disappointment that tasted like broken glass. "Well, maybe we could do lunch earlier in the day? Just for an hour?" There was a pause, and I could hear muffled conversation. Lucas had covered the phone, but I could still make out Isabella's tone. Not the words, but the unmistakable cadence of someone giving instructions. "You know what, Mom? We're really busy that whole weekend. With the party and everything. Maybe we could do something the following week?" The following week. Always the following week, the following month, the following year. I was living in a perpetual state of postponement, constantly being scheduled for a future that never seemed to arrive. "Of course," I said, because what else could I say? "Whenever works for you." But I knew, even as I said it, that the following week would bring another excuse, another reason why seeing his mother was inconvenient for the life he was building. 2 weeks later, I saw them at the grocery store. I was buying milk and bread, the staples of a lonely person's diet, when I spotted Lucas in the produce section. My heart leaped with such sudden joy that I almost called out to him like I was seeing a long-lost friend. He was selecting apples with the careful attention of someone who had been trained in domestic excellence. Isabella stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm in that possessive gesture I had come to recognize. She was pregnant. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The gentle curve of her belly, the way Lucas's hand occasionally drifted to touch it, the soft glow that people always talked about, but I had never really noticed before. It was all there, announcing a future I hadn't been invited to witness. I stood frozen in the cereal aisle, clutching my shopping basket with white knuckles, watching my son tenderly place apples in a bag for the woman who was carrying my grandchild. A grandchild I knew nothing about. A baby I would be lucky to meet, let alone know. They moved through the store with the easy intimacy of people who shared everything. Grocery lists, inside jokes, a future that had no space for inconvenient mothers. I followed at a distance, not close enough to be noticed, but near enough to observe this glimpse into the life I had been excluded from. At one point, Isabella said something that made Lucas laugh. A real laugh. The kind I remembered from his childhood. The sound pierced through me like a knife, not because it was cruel, but because it was joyful. He was happy, completely, genuinely happy in a world that didn't include me. I watched them check out together, observed the way the cashier smiled at them, this beautiful young couple expecting their first child, the picture of everything American society celebrated. They were living a Norman Rockwell painting, and I was just a smudge in the background that spoiled the composition. They walked to their car, a new SUV I had never seen before, suitable for car seats and family trips, and all the adventures they would share without me. As they loaded their groceries, Isabella's hand went to her belly again, and Lucas leaned down to whisper something to her stomach. I stood in the parking lot holding my pathetic bag of single-person groceries and watched my son talk to my grandchild for the first time. A grandchild who would grow up thinking of Isabella's mother as Grandma, and me as, what? A stranger who sent awkward birthday cards? An inconvenient relic from Daddy's past? That night, I did something I had never done before. I called Lucas and confronted him directly. "I saw you at the store today," I said without preamble when he answered. Silence. Then, "Oh, why didn't you say hello?" "Because you looked like you didn't want to be bothered," I said, and immediately regretted how bitter I sounded. "Lucas, are you going to tell me about the baby? Or was I supposed to figure it out from grocery store surveillance?" Another pause. More muffled conversation. "Mom, we were going to tell you." "When?" I asked. "After the baby was born? After college graduation? When exactly was I going to become important enough to share your news with?" "It's not like that," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We just wanted to get through the first trimester. You know how it is." No, I didn't know how it was. I had been a single mother with no husband to whisper plans to, no family to strategize with. When I was pregnant with Lucas, I had told everyone who would listen because he was the most important thing that had ever happened to me. "Congratulations," I said, because that's what mothers are supposed to say, even when their hearts are breaking. "I'm happy for you." "Thanks, Mom. We're really excited." We, always we, never I. Lucas had disappeared so completely into his marriage that he no longer existed as an individual person with his own thoughts, his own feelings, his own mother. "I'd like to help," I said carefully, "with the baby. I know I'm not much, but I could babysit sometimes or help with—" "That's really sweet, Mom," he said, and the condescension in his voice made me feel like a child offering to help with grown-up tasks. "But Isabella's mother is already planning to move closer when the baby comes. She's taking early retirement so she can be a full-time grandmother." A full-time grandmother. Isabella's mother, a woman I had met exactly twice, who had looked at me during the wedding preparations like I was hired help, was going to be the grandmother, the real grandmother. I would be relegated to whatever category they created for inconvenient relatives who couldn't be completely ignored. "What about me?" I asked, and hated how small my voice sounded. "You'll be a grandmother too, Mom." "Of course you will." But we both knew it wasn't true. I would be a grandmother, in name only, someone who existed on the margins of my grandchild's life, brought in for obligatory visits and perfunctory phone calls. Isabella's mother would be the one who knew the baby's schedule, who had opinions about feeding and sleeping and discipline. She would be the one in the delivery room, the one who held the baby first after the parents, the one whose advice was sought and valued. I would be lucky to get a birth announcement. "I should go," Lucas said. "Isabella needs me to help set up the nursery." Of course she did. Isabella always needed him for something that didn't involve me. After I hung up, I sat in my dark apartment and tried to imagine the nursery they were creating together. I pictured Lucas assembling a crib with the same careful attention he had once brought to building blanket forts in my living room. I imagined Isabella choosing colors and themes, making decisions about the environment where my grandchild would spend their earliest days. I thought about the nursery I could offer, the guest room in my apartment that I had always imagined converting someday, the rocking chair that had been my mother's, the lullabies I remembered from Lucas's infancy. But my offerings seemed shabby compared to what Isabella's family could provide: money, space, status, and most importantly, Isabella's approval. I was becoming a ghost in my own family story, visible only when the light hit just right, substantial enough to cast a shadow but not solid enough to matter. The loneliness was becoming physical now, a weight in my chest that made breathing difficult. I found myself talking to Lucas's childhood photos, carrying on conversations with a little boy who had loved me unconditionally. Sometimes I would catch myself setting two places at the dinner table, forgetting for just a moment that those days were over. I was disappearing, piece by piece, from the only life I had ever known how to live. The baby arrived on a Tuesday in October, and I learned about it from a Facebook post. I was sitting in the library where I worked part-time, shelving returns in the quiet afternoon lull, when my phone buzzed with a notification. Isabella had tagged Lucas in a photo, a tiny, perfect face wrapped in a blue blanket, with the caption, "Welcome to the world, Benjamin Lucas Morrison. Daddy and Mommy are so in love. Blessed our little miracle tattered new parents, Benjamin Lucas Morrison, my grandson, named partly after his father, the son I had raised alone, the boy I had sacrificed everything for." And I was learning about his existence through social media, like any random acquaintance who happened to follow Isabella's carefully curated online life. I stared at that tiny face on my phone screen, trying to see Lucas in his features, trying to feel the connection that grandmothers were supposed to feel. But all I could think about was how I should have been in that hospital room, how I should have been one of the first people to hold him, to welcome him into our family. Instead, I was discovering my own flesh and blood through a filtered Instagram photo that had already received dozens of heart emojis from strangers. The comment section was filled with congratulations from Isabella's friends, her co-workers, her extended family. "He's gorgeous! Congratulations! Can't wait to meet him." Everyone seemed to have a place in Benjamin's future except the woman who had given birth to his father. I screenshot the photo before I could stop myself, then immediately felt pathetic for doing it. This was how desperate I had become, hoarding digital scraps of my own grandchild like a beggar collecting coins. My phone rang an hour later. Finally. "Mom?" Lucas's voice sounded exhausted but happy, the way new fathers are supposed to sound. "I wanted to call and tell you." "I already know," I said, and couldn't keep the hurt out of my voice. "I saw it on Instagram." Silence. Then, "Oh, I'm sorry, Mom. Things have been so crazy. Isabella's parents flew in and her sister, and there was so much happening." "I understand," I said, even though I didn't. Even though I couldn't fathom how announcing your child's birth to the world came before calling your own mother. "How is he? How are you?" "He's perfect," Lucas said, and for a moment his voice had the same wonder it used to have when he discovered something amazing as a little boy. 10 fingers, 10 toes, lungs that definitely work. Isabella did amazing. She was so strong. Isabella did amazing. Isabella was strong. I listened to my son praise his wife for giving birth while I sat alone in a library, surrounded by other people's stories, invisible in my own. "When can I meet him?" I asked, trying to sound casual, trying not to sound like I was begging for access to my own grandchild. Another pause. Muffled conversation that was becoming the soundtrack of my relationship with Lucas. "Well, the doctor wants to limit visitors for the first few weeks," he said finally. "You know, immune system and all that. And Isabella's still recovering, so we're keeping things pretty quiet." Quiet. Except for Isabella's mother, who I could hear cooing in the background. Except for Isabella's sister, whose laugh drifted through the phone line. Except for all the people who belonged in Benjamin's story while I remained an outsider looking in. "Of course," I said. "Just let me know when it's convenient." "Absolutely, Mom. Maybe in a few weeks, when things settle down." When things settle down. The eternal promise that never came true. 3 weeks passed, then 4, then 6. I watched Benjamin grow through social media posts like a stranger following a celebrity baby. First smile, first bath, first outfit change. Isabella documented every moment for her online audience while I remained locked out of my grandson's actual life. I finally broke down and bought a gift, a simple blue sweater that I had knitted myself during the long, lonely evenings when I had nothing else to do with my hands. I wrapped it carefully and drove to their house, telling myself that surely they wouldn't turn away a grandmother bearing gifts for her first grandchild. Isabella answered the door in yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back in the effortless style of women who looked beautiful even when exhausted. Behind her, I could hear Lucas's voice talking in the high, sing-song tone people use with babies. "Martha," she said, and somehow managed to make my own name sound like an inconvenience. "What a surprise. I brought something for Benjamin," I said, holding up the wrapped package like an offering. I was hoping maybe I could meet him. Isabella's smile was perfectly polite and completely cold. That's so thoughtful. But he's sleeping right now, and we're really trying to stick to his schedule. You know how important routines are for babies. I could hear him in the background, not sleeping, but making the small gurgling sounds that newborns make when they're awake and alert. She was lying to my face with the casual ease of someone who had had plenty of practice. Maybe I could just peek at him, I asked, hating how desperate I sounded. I promise I won't wake him up. I just want to see him for a minute. You know, Isabella said, not moving from the doorway, not inviting me inside. I think it would be better if we plan something for next week, when we're more prepared. When Lucas can be here too. Lucas was there. I could hear his voice, could see his shadow moving in the living room, but somehow he wasn't available to see his own mother. Please, I said, and the word came out broken. He's my grandson. I just want to hold him once. Something shifted in Isabella's expression, not softening, but something colder, more resolved. Martha, she said, her voice taking on the tone of someone addressing a difficult child, I need you to understand that Benjamin's well-being comes first. His schedule, his health, his routine, all of that has to be our priority right now. I'm sure you can appreciate that as a mother yourself, as a mother myself. The phrase was designed to sound inclusive, but it felt like a slap. She was using my own motherhood against me, suggesting that a real mother would understand why I needed to be kept away from my grandchild. I raised Lucas alone, I said quietly. I know how to hold a baby. Of course you do, Isabella said with that practiced smile. And I'm sure you did a wonderful job. But every parent has to make their own decisions about what's best for their child. I hope you can respect that. She was dismissing me like a door-to-door salesperson, polite but firm, making it clear that I was unwelcome without actually saying the words. Behind her, Lucas's voice continued its gentle murmur to the baby I wasn't allowed to meet. I handed her the wrapped sweater, knowing she would probably donate it to charity or throw it away. For Benjamin, I said, when he's ready. Thank you, she said, already closing the door. That's very thoughtful. We'll be in touch about a visit soon. I stood on their doorstep for a long moment after the door closed, listening to the sounds of family life continuing without me. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of Lucas holding Benjamin, bouncing him gently while Isabella watched with the satisfied expression of someone whose world was exactly as she wanted it to be. Driving home, I passed a playground where other grandmothers were pushing their grandchildren on swings, sharing snacks and stories, and the easy intimacy of families who belonged together. I thought about all the things I would never do with Benjamin, the bedtime stories I wouldn't read, the cookies we wouldn't bake together, the wisdom I wouldn't be allowed to share. That night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by all the baby preparations I had made in secret, the children's books I had been collecting, the photo albums I had prepared to fill with pictures of my grandson, the rocking chair I had refinished in anticipation of quiet moments that would never come. I looked at the photos on my mantle. Lucas as a baby, Lucas as a child, Lucas growing up in this same apartment that now felt like a museum to a life that no longer mattered. In every picture, he was looking at me with love, with trust, with the absolute certainty that I would always be the most important person in his world. Now he couldn't even come to the door to say hello to the woman who had given him everything. I pulled out my phone and opened Instagram again, scrolling through Isabella's perfect documentation of their perfect life. There was Benjamin in his nursery, surrounded by expensive toys and designer decorations. There was Lucas reading him a book, his face soft with fatherly love. There was Isabella's mother holding him, captioned, "Grandma's precious boy, Grandma's precious boy." Not one of Grandma's precious boys, the precious boy, the only grandmother who mattered. I was becoming a ghost story in my own family, something that used to exist, that people might mention in passing, but that had no real substance anymore. A character who had served her purpose in the first act, but was no longer needed for the rest of the play. The silence in my apartment wasn't just quiet anymore. It was the sound of a heart breaking so slowly that each crack echoed for hours before the next one came. But I still had something they had forgotten about, something they couldn't take away from me, even if they wanted to. I still had myself. The turning point came on a Thursday morning in January, when I woke up and couldn't remember the last time I had done something for myself. Not something related to Lucas, not something hoping to win back his attention, not something designed to make me more acceptable to Isabella's version of family. just something because I wanted to. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my morning coffee, staring at the calendar on the wall where I had been marking days like a prisoner counting down a sentence. 3 months since Benjamin's birth. 3 months of hoping for phone calls that never came, planning visits that never happened, buying gifts that would never be given. That's when I noticed the flyer that had been sitting on my counter for weeks. Something about volunteer opportunities at the women's shelter downtown. I had picked it up at the library and forgotten about it, but now it seemed to glow with possibility in the morning light. New beginnings. Women's Shelter seeks compassionate volunteers to help women and children in crisis. It read. Training provided. All backgrounds welcome. Make a difference in someone's life. Make a difference in someone's life. When was the last time I had made a difference in anyone's life? When was the last time someone had needed me for something that mattered? I called the number before I could change my mind. The woman who answered had a warm voice and a slight southern accent. Her name was Patricia, and she explained that they were always looking for volunteers who could help with everything from serving meals to organizing donations to simply sitting with women who needed someone to listen. We have an orientation session this Saturday morning, she said. Nothing fancy, just coffee and conversation about what we do here. Would you like to come? For the first time in months, I said yes to something without checking first whether it would interfere with Lucas's schedule, whether it might make me unavailable for a call that wouldn't come anyway. The shelter was housed in a converted Victorian mansion on the edge of downtown, its faded grandeur speaking to better days, while its current purpose spoke to harder realities. Paint peeled from the wraparound porch, and the lawn needed attention, but the windows glowed with warm light, and the front door bore a hand-painted sign that read, Welcome Home. Inside, the orientation group was small, 6 women of various ages, all looking slightly uncertain but hopeful. Patricia turned out to be a woman in her 60s with silver hair and eyes that had clearly seen everything, but somehow maintained their kindness. The women who come here, she explained, have lost everything. Sometimes it's because of abuse, sometimes addiction, sometimes just the kind of bad luck that can happen to anyone. They arrive with nothing but whatever they can carry, and they're trying to rebuild their entire lives from scratch. She talked about the children who lived at the shelter temporarily. Kids who had been uprooted from everything familiar, who needed stability and kindness while their mothers figured out how to create new lives for them. She talked about the practical needs, meals, clothing, job search assistance, but also the emotional ones, the need to feel human again, the need to be listened to, without judgment. The most important thing we offer, Patricia said, isn't food or shelter, though those matter. It's dignity. It's treating people like they have value even when they can't see it themselves. Dignity. The word hit me like recognition. I knew exactly what it felt like to have your value questioned, to be treated like an inconvenience rather than a person worthy of respect. After the orientation, I stayed to help serve lunch. The dining room was full of women and children, their stories written in tired eyes and careful movements. Some chatted easily with volunteers, while others ate in silence, still guarded against kindness that might be taken away. I was refilling water glasses when I noticed her, a girl who couldn't have been more than 19, sitting alone at a corner table with a baby who looked to be about Benjamin's age. She had the kind of fresh-faced beauty that hadn't quite been worn away by whatever circumstances had brought her here, but her eyes held an exhaustion that seemed too deep for someone so young. More water? I asked, approaching her table with the pitcher. She looked up with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. Thank you, she said quietly, her accent revealing an education that didn't match her current circumstances. The baby in her arms, a little girl with dark hair and solemn eyes, stared at me with the intense focus that babies sometimes have, as if they're trying to figure out whether you're safe. She's beautiful, I said, and meant it. What's her name? Sophia, the young woman said, and her whole face softened when she looked at her daughter. Sophia Rose. She's 4 months old. 4 months. Just a month older than Benjamin, the grandson I had seen only in photographs. I'm Martha, I said, sitting down across from her without being invited, following an instinct I didn't fully understand. Emma, she replied, then hesitated before adding, Thank you for not asking why we're here. I understood that gratitude. I knew what it felt like to be reduced to your circumstances, to have people look at you and see only your problems rather than your humanity. Over the following weeks, I found myself returning to the shelter every Tuesday and Thursday, I helped in the kitchen, sorted donations, played with the children while their mothers attended job interviews or counseling sessions. But mostly, I found myself drawn to Emma and Sophia. Emma's story emerged gradually, shared in fragments during quiet moments when Sophia napped and the dining room emptied. She had been a college student studying education when she met Sophia's father, a charming man who seemed perfect until pregnancy revealed his true nature. The emotional abuse started slowly, then escalated after Sophia's birth. When he began threatening the baby, Emma had packed what she could carry and left with nothing but her daughter and the clothes on their backs. "I keep thinking I should have known better," she said one afternoon as we folded donated clothes together. "I was smart. I had plans. I was going to be a teacher, help kids learn to love reading. But somehow I ended up here, dependent on charity, unable to even provide a proper home for my daughter." "You are providing for her," I said firmly. "You got her away from someone who would have hurt her. You brought her somewhere safe. That's what mothers do. We protect our children, even when it costs us everything." Emma looked at me with surprise, as if the idea that she might be a good mother despite her circumstances had never occurred to her. "Do you have children?" she asked. The question should have been simple, but it opened up a well of complicated feelings. Did I have children? I had given birth to a son, raised him, loved him, sacrificed for him, but did I still have him in any meaningful way? "I have a son," I said finally. "He's 29, married, just had a baby." "Oh, you're a grandmother." Emma's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "That must be wonderful. I bet you spoil your grandchild terribly." I opened my mouth to agree, to maintain the polite fiction that my family life was normal and happy, but something about Emma's honesty, about the courage it had taken for her to rebuild her life from nothing, made me want to tell the truth. "I've never met my grandson," I said quietly. "His mother, my daughter-in-law, she doesn't think I'm suitable for their life." Emma stared at me with the kind of shock that comes from recognizing a pain you never expected to encounter. "But you're his grandmother. You have rights. Not legal ones," I said, "and not moral ones, apparently. My son agrees with his wife that I'm not necessary to their family." We sat in silence for a moment, two women who had been discarded by the people who were supposed to love them most. "I'm sorry," Emma said finally. "That's horrible. I can't imagine, after everything you must have done for him." "I thought love was enough," I said. "I thought if I loved him perfectly, sacrificed everything for him, it would create a bond that couldn't be broken. I was wrong." "No," Emma said fiercely. "You weren't wrong to love him. He's wrong to throw that away." Her certainty surprised me. Here was a 19-year-old girl who had lost everything, defending my right to be loved by my own son. Her indignation on my behalf felt like a gift I hadn't known I needed. "You know what I've learned here?" Emma continued, bouncing Sophia gently as the baby began to fuss. "I've learned that sometimes the family you choose is better than the family you're born with. Patricia treats me more like a daughter than my own mother ever did. The other women here care more about Sophia's well-being than her own father ever did." She looked around the shelter's dining room, where women were cleaning up after lunch, helping each other with childcare, sharing resources and encouragement. "This place taught me that my value doesn't depend on other people recognizing it," she said. "I'm a good mother whether Sophia's father admits it or not. I'm a smart woman whether my family believes in me or not. And you're a loving mother and grandmother whether your son appreciates it or not." That night, I lay in bed thinking about Emma's words. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about what I could do to win back Lucas's love. I wasn't planning strategies to make myself more acceptable to Isabella. I wasn't cataloging my failures as a mother or wondering what I had done wrong. Instead, I was thinking about the woman I had been before I defined myself entirely through my relationship with my son. The woman who had raised him alone, who had worked multiple jobs, who had been strong enough to build a life from nothing when his father abandoned us. That woman was still inside me somewhere. She had just been buried under years of trying to be perfect for someone who no longer wanted her perfection. I had spent so much time looking backward, mourning what I had lost, that I had forgotten to look forward toward what I might still become. The next morning, I called the shelter and asked if they needed any additional volunteers for the evening shift. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't a strategy to win anyone back. It was just the first step toward remembering who I was when no one else was watching. 6 months into my work at the shelter, something fundamental had shifted inside me. I still thought about Lucas every day, still felt the ache of missing my grandson, but the desperate urgency had faded. I no longer spent my evenings rehearsing phone calls I might make, or planning gifts that would never be appreciated. Instead, I found myself looking forward to my volunteer shifts, to the conversations with Emma as she prepared for her GED exam, to the small victories we celebrated when women found jobs or secured their own apartments. Emma had become like a daughter to me, and Sophia, like the grandchild I was allowed to love freely. I had taught Sophia to clap her hands, had been there for her first solid food, had rocked her to sleep during evening shifts when Emma was in counseling sessions. These weren't stolen moments or grudging allowances. They were gifts freely given and gratefully received. "You know," Emma said one evening as we watched Sophia play with blocks on the shelter's living room floor, "you're the grandmother I always hoped Sophia would have. Patient, kind, present. She lights up when she sees you." The words filled a hollow place in my chest that I had almost forgotten existed. To be wanted, to be valued, to be seen as a gift rather than a burden. These were feelings I had nearly given up on. "You've both saved me in ways you'll never understand," I told her honestly. I was disappearing before I came here, becoming invisible in my own life. "Well, you're definitely not invisible here," Emma laughed, gesturing around the room where several other women were reading or chatting quietly. "Patricia says you're the most reliable volunteer they've ever had, and Mrs. Chen says you're the only person who can get her grandson to eat vegetables." Mrs. Chen was an elderly Chinese woman who had fled an abusive son-in-law with her 3-year-old grandson. She spoke little English, but somehow she and I had developed a communication that transcended language. I had learned to cook simple Chinese dishes for the boy, and she had taught me lullabies in Mandarin that seemed to calm any fussy child. The shelter had become my real family, filled with women who understood loss and resilience in ways that my former life had never required. We shared resources, celebrated small victories, and supported each other through setbacks without judgment or conditions. It was during this period of newfound stability that I began to notice signs that my old life was experiencing its own turbulence. The first hint came through Isabella's Instagram, which I still checked occasionally, not with the desperate hunger I used to feel, but with the distant curiosity you might have about a television show you used to watch. Her posts had become less frequent and more forced. The smiles looked strained, the captions shorter and less enthusiastic. Then I saw Lucas at the grocery store again, but this time he was alone, pushing a cart with the mechanical movements of someone going through motions. He looked older than his 29 years, his face bearing the weight of exhaustion that goes deeper than simple sleep deprivation. When he reached for a box of cereal, I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. I almost approached him. For a moment, my old instincts kicked in, the desire to comfort him, to ask what was wrong, to offer whatever help he might need. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the memory of standing on his doorstep with a gift for Benjamin, being dismissed like an unwelcome solicitor. Maybe it was the understanding I had gained about dignity and self-worth during my months at the shelter. Or maybe it was simply that I was no longer the same woman who would chase after someone who had made it clear she wasn't wanted. 2 weeks later, my phone rang at 11 o'clock at night. I was reading in bed, enjoying the luxury of a good book and solitude that no longer felt like loneliness. When I saw Lucas's name on the screen, my first reaction wasn't joy or hope. It was wariness. "Mom?" His voice sounded wrong, strained and thin, like a guitar string pulled too tight. "Lucas, it's late. Is everything okay?" There was a long pause, and I heard something that sounded like a sob being swallowed. "Mom, can I come over? I know it's late, but I need to talk to someone." The old me would have said yes immediately, would have rushed to put on coffee and tidy the apartment and prepare for the return of my prodigal son. But the new me, the woman who had learned her worth at a shelter for displaced women, found herself asking a question that would have been unthinkable a year ago. "What about Isabella? Shouldn't you be talking to your wife?" Another pause, longer this time. "Isabella and we're having some problems. She thinks I should handle things on my own. She says talking to you that it wouldn't be good for our marriage." There it was. Even in crisis, even when he needed me, Lucas was still filtering everything through Isabella's approval. He wasn't calling because he missed me, or because he had realized what he had thrown away. He was calling because his wife had temporarily failed him, and I was the backup plan. I see, I said calmly. And what makes you think I'm available to be your emergency support system? The question seemed to shock him into silence. In all his life, I had never been anything but immediately, unconditionally available. The idea that I might have boundaries, that I might require something more than desperation to open my door, had apparently never occurred to him. Mom, I just really need someone right now. I don't have anyone else. You don't have anyone else because you chose not to have anyone else, I said, and my voice was steady in a way that surprised me. You decided I wasn't important enough to include in your life. You haven't called in months. You've never let me meet my grandson. You've made it very clear that I don't matter to your family. That's not how it is, he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. Then how is it, Lucas? Explain to me how a mother goes from being the most important person in her son's life to someone who learns about her grandchild's birth through Instagram. I heard him crying then, real tears, not the controlled emotion he had been trying to maintain. The sound broke my heart, but it didn't break my resolve. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but I don't know what to do anymore. Everything is falling apart, and I need my mom. He needed his mom. After months of treating me like an inconvenient stranger, he suddenly needed his mom. But I wasn't the same mom he had discarded. I had learned things about myself during our separation, had discovered strengths I hadn't known I possessed. What's happened? I asked, not agreeing to see him but not hanging up either. Benjamin has been sick, he said, his words coming out in a rush. Really sick. He's been in the hospital for 2 weeks with some kind of infection. The doctors aren't sure what's wrong, and Isabella blames me because I wanted to take him to the park last month when he had a little cold. She says I don't understand children, that I make bad decisions, that I'm just like... He stopped abruptly. Just like what, Lucas? Just like you, he whispered. She says I make the same kind of poor choices you always made, that I'm weak, like you were weak. The words hung in the air between us, carrying years of Isabella's poison finally spoken aloud. All this time she hadn't just been excluding me from their life, she had been systematically destroying Lucas's perception of me, turning every choice I had made as a single mother into evidence of inadequacy. I see, I said quietly. And what do you think, Lucas? Do you think I was weak? Do you think the choices I made raising you were poor ones? Another long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. No, he said. No, Mom. You were amazing. You gave me everything. You worked so hard and you never complained, and you always made me feel loved and safe. I don't know why I let her. I don't know how I forgot. You forgot because it was easier than standing up to her, I said. You forgot because choosing me would have meant conflict in your marriage, and you decided I wasn't worth fighting for. The truth of those words settled between us like a stone dropping into still water, creating ripples that would reach the shores of everything we had been to each other. You're right, he said finally. You're absolutely right, and I don't know how to fix it. For the first time in our conversation, I felt something soften in my chest. Not forgiveness. That would take time and proof of change, but recognition of the man I had raised, buried beneath the husband Isabella had tried to create. I don't know either, I said honestly, but I know it can't be fixed in one phone call because you're having marriage problems. It can't be fixed because you suddenly need something from me. If you want me back in your life, Lucas, it has to be because you want me there, not because you need a backup plan. I do want you back, he said urgently. I miss you so much, Mom. I miss talking to you. I miss your advice. I miss feeling like I have a family that actually loves me for who I am, instead of who they want me to be. The words were right, but I had learned to listen for what lay beneath them, and beneath Lucas's desperation, I still heard the assumption that I would be available whenever he decided he was ready to have me back. Benjamin, I said. How is he really? He's going to be okay, Lucas said. The doctors figured out what was wrong yesterday. It was just a bacterial infection that needed the right antibiotic. He should be home in a couple of days. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by another realization. Lucas had called me after the crisis was over, when Benjamin was safe. Even in his moment of greatest need, he hadn't thought to include me until the emergency had passed. I'm glad he's going to be okay, I said. But Lucas, I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person you left behind. I've built a life that doesn't revolve around waiting for you to need me. What do you mean? I thought about Emma and Sophia, about Mrs. Chen and her grandson, about all the women at the shelter who had learned to value themselves independent of anyone else's recognition. I mean, I'm not sitting here hoping for your call anymore. I'm not planning my life around the possibility that you might want me back. I've found places where I'm valued, where I'm needed, where I make a difference. And I'm not giving that up just because you've decided you made a mistake. The silence that followed was different from the others. This wasn't Lucas calculating what Isabella would approve of, or struggling to find words that wouldn't offend anyone. This was the silence of someone confronting the consequences of choices they couldn't take back. What does that mean for us? He asked finally. It means, I said carefully, that if you want a relationship with me, you'll have to earn it. The way anyone earns a relationship, with time, with consistency, with proof that you value what you're asking for. And if I do that, if I prove that I've changed, I looked around my small apartment, at the photos of the shelter children on my refrigerator, at the stack of books I was reading to improve my volunteer skills, at the life I had built from the ashes of the one he had burned down. Then we'll see, I said. But Lucas, this time, you don't get to disappear when things get difficult. This time, you don't get to choose Isabella's comfort over my dignity. If you want me in your life, I come as a package deal with my worth intact. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment and waited to feel the familiar hope that maybe everything would go back to the way it used to be. But that hope didn't come. Instead, I felt something much more powerful. The certainty that I would never again settle for being someone's afterthought. 3 weeks passed after Lucas's desperate phone call, and I heard nothing more from him. Part of me wondered if I had been too harsh, if I had lost my only chance to rebuild our relationship. But the larger part of me, the part that had grown strong at the shelter, that had learned the difference between love and enabling, knew I had done the right thing. I was at the shelter on a Thursday evening, helping Emma study for her GED math exam while Sophia played at our feet, when Patricia approached with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Martha," she said quietly, "there's someone here to see you. A young man. Says he's your son." My heart did a small flip, but I kept my voice steady. "Did he say what he wanted?" "Just that he needed to speak with you. He's in the front lobby, and he has a baby with him. Benjamin." Lucas had brought Benjamin. I found them sitting on the worn couch in the shelter's entryway. Lucas looked even more exhausted than he had at the grocery store, his clothes wrinkled and his hair uncombed. But it was the sight of Benjamin that made my breath catch. 10 months old now, sitting on his father's lap and looking around with the bright curiosity that all healthy babies possess. He was beautiful, dark hair like Lucas had as a baby, serious brown eyes that studied everything with intensity. He was wearing a little blue sweater that I didn't recognize, and tiny jeans that made him look like a miniature person rather than just a baby. "Mom," Lucas said when he saw me, and his voice cracked on the word. "Hello, Lucas." I sat down across from them, maintaining the distance that felt necessary. "What brings you here?" "I wanted you to meet Benjamin," he said simply, "and I wanted him to meet his grandmother." The words should have filled me with joy, but I had learned to be cautious of gifts that came with hidden prices. "Does Isabella know you're here?" Lucas's face crumpled slightly. "Isabella and we separated yesterday. She took Benjamin to her parents' house, but I have him for the afternoon. She doesn't know I brought him here." "I see." I studied my son's face, looking for signs of manipulation or desperation. But what I saw was different. Something that looked like genuine remorse, mixed with a kind of exhausted honesty I hadn't seen from him in years. Benjamin chose that moment to reach toward me, his small hand opening and closing in the universal baby gesture for "pick me up." The sight nearly undid my resolve. "Can I?" I asked, not wanting to assume anything. Lucas nodded, and I carefully took my grandson into my arms for the first time. He was heavier than I expected, solid and warm and real in a way that Instagram photos could never convey. He smelled like baby soap and that indefinable scent that all healthy children carry, the smell of possibility and innocence. Benjamin studied my face with serious concentration, then suddenly smiled, a real smile that crinkled his eyes and showed his few teeth. My heart broke open in the best possible way. "He's perfect," I whispered, unable to keep the emotion out of my voice. "He looks like you did at that age," Lucas said softly. "Same eyes, same way of watching everything like he's trying to figure out how the world works." For a few minutes, we sat in comfortable silence while Benjamin explored my face with his fingers, pulled at my hair, and made the small babbling sounds that almost toddlers use to communicate. It felt natural, right? Like something that should have happened months ago. "Mom," Lucas said eventually, "I need to tell you some things. Things I should have said a long time ago." I looked up from Benjamin, who had settled contentedly in my lap and was examining the buttons on my cardigan. "I'm listening." Lucas took a deep breath, like someone preparing to dive into cold water. "When I called you 3 weeks ago, you asked me if I thought you were weak, if I thought the choices you made raising me were poor ones. I said no, but I need you to understand how wrong I was to ever let Isabella convince me otherwise." He leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "You worked 3 jobs so I could take piano lessons. You drove me to every baseball practice even though your car was falling apart and you couldn't afford the gas. When I was sick, you stayed up all night taking care of me even though you had to work the next morning. When Dad left, you never once made me feel like it was my fault, or like I was a burden." Benjamin had found the small gold cross I wore around my neck and was trying to put it in his mouth. I gently extracted it from his fingers while listening to Lucas's words. "You sacrificed everything for me," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "Your social life, your career prospects, probably relationships with men who might have made you happy. You gave me everything you had, and you never once asked for anything in return except that I be the best person I could be." "Lucas, no, please let me finish." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Isabella told me you were clingy, that you couldn't let go, that healthy families have boundaries. She made me feel guilty for loving you, like wanting to spend time with you was somehow betraying my marriage." Benjamin had moved on from my necklace and was now fascinated by my earrings. I adjusted him on my lap, marveling at how perfectly he fit against me, how natural it felt to hold him. "She said you didn't understand our new life, that you would try to interfere with our parenting, that you would spoil Benjamin and undermine our authority. She made it sound like protecting him from you was part of being a good father." The pain in his voice was real, but so was my own. These weren't just hurtful words. They were the justifications he had used to exclude me from the most important moments of his life. "And you believed her," I said quietly. "I wanted to believe her because it was easier than standing up to her, because admitting she was wrong would have meant admitting that I was letting her hurt the person who had loved me most unconditionally my entire life." Benjamin had grown fussy and was rubbing his eyes, the universal sign that a baby needs a nap. Without thinking, I stood and began the gentle swaying motion that comes naturally to anyone who has ever soothed a child. He immediately settled against my shoulder with a contented sigh. "When Benjamin got sick," Lucas continued, watching his son find comfort in my arms, "and Isabella blamed me for every decision I made, I realized what I had lost. You never blamed me for anything. Even when I made mistakes, even when I disappointed you, you always believed I was fundamentally good and could do better." I felt Benjamin's breathing slow as he drifted toward sleep. Holding him felt like holding a piece of my heart that had been missing for too long. "Isabella's parents came to the hospital," Lucas said. "They took over everything, talked to the doctors, made decisions about his care, acted like I was incompetent to care for my own son, and I realized that's how I had treated you, like you were incompetent to be part of your own grandson's life." "Where does this leave us, Lucas?" I asked, still swaying gently with Benjamin. "What do you want from me now?" "I want to earn back your trust," he said without hesitation. "I want to be the son you deserved all along. I want Benjamin to know his grandmother, not just know about you, but really know you. I want him to feel as loved and safe with you as I did when I was growing up." "And Isabella?" Lucas's face hardened slightly. "Isabella made her choice when she gave me an ultimatum. She said I could have a relationship with you or I could have a marriage with her, but not both. She said if I brought Benjamin to see you, she would file for divorce and fight for full custody." My blood ran cold. "Lucas, you can't risk losing Benjamin. I can't risk him growing up without knowing you," he interrupted. "I can't risk him missing out on the kind of love you gave me. And I can't live with myself knowing that I chose my own comfort over doing what's right." Benjamin had fallen asleep in my arms, his small hand curled against my shoulder. Looking down at his peaceful face, I felt a fierce protectiveness that I hadn't experienced since Lucas was small. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now I fight for joint custody. Now I make sure Benjamin has access to both sides of his family. Now I stop letting other people decide who gets to love my son." Lucas stood up and walked to where I was standing with Benjamin. For a moment, we both looked down at the sleeping child, and I saw something in my son's face that I hadn't seen in years. Determination mixed with peace, as if he had finally figured out who he wanted to be. "Mom," he said quietly, "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I hurt you in ways that can't be undone, but if you'll let me, I want to spend whatever time I have left making sure you know how grateful I am for everything you gave me." Benjamin stirred slightly in my arms, and I looked into Lucas's face, really looked at him, for the first time in over a year. What I saw there wasn't the desperate man who had called me 3 weeks ago, begging for emergency support. This was someone who had made a conscious choice to do the right thing, even when it was difficult. "It won't be easy," I said softly. "Rebuilding trust takes time." "I know," he said, "but Mom, I've got time, and I've finally got my priorities straight." As if in response to our conversation, Benjamin opened his eyes and looked back and forth between Lucas and me with the solemn wisdom that babies sometimes seem to possess. Then he smiled, a smile that included both of us, that seemed to say he knew exactly where he belonged. For the first time in over a year, I smiled back at my son without reservation, not because everything was fixed, but because something broken had finally begun to heal. "Well then," I said, adjusting Benjamin in my arms, "I suppose we'd better get started." Outside the shelter's windows, I could see the other volunteers setting up for the evening meal service. Emma was probably wondering where I had gone, but for this moment, standing in the lobby with my son and grandson, I felt the profound satisfaction of a life that was finally whole again, not because Lucas had come back to me, but because I had become someone worth coming back to. 6 months later, I was sitting in my apartment on a Sunday morning, watching Benjamin take his first unsteady steps between the coffee table and the couch. At 15 months old, he had become a fixture in my life, not through desperate negotiations or stolen moments, but through the natural rhythm of a family that had learned to function with love and respect. "Grandma! Grandma!" he called, his vocabulary limited but his meaning crystal clear. He wanted me to catch him, to celebrate his achievement, to be part of his world in the way grandmothers were meant to be. Lucas sat on my couch, looking more relaxed than I had seen him in years. The divorce had been finalized 2 months earlier, and while it hadn't been easy, it had been necessary. Isabella had fought for full custody, painting Lucas as an unfit father influenced by his unstable mother. But the court had seen through her manipulations, especially when several witnesses testified about the emotional abuse she had subjected both Lucas and me to. "She's really showing her true colors now," Lucas said, scrolling through his phone to show me Isabella's latest social media post, a carefully crafted image of herself looking strong and independent, with a caption about removing toxic people from your life for your child's well-being. "Don't read those," I advised, lifting Benjamin as he totaled over to me. "She's trying to rewrite history to make herself the victim. Let her. The people who matter know the truth." And they did. Lucas's friends, the ones who had known him before Isabella, had welcomed me back into his life with warmth and apologies for their own silence during the years of my exile. His coworkers, who had met Isabella only briefly, seemed relieved that the tense, unhappy man they had known was being replaced by someone who smiled easily and talked proudly about his mother and son. Benjamin settled onto my lap with a picture book, pointing at the animals and making his approximations of their sounds. This had become our Sunday ritual: breakfast together, playtime, stories, and the comfortable domesticity that I had been denied for so long. "Mom," Lucas said, setting down his phone, "I need to tell you something." I looked up from the book, where Benjamin was enthusiastically pointing at a cow and saying, "Moo," with great satisfaction. "Emma called me yesterday," he continued. "She wanted to thank you for writing that letter of recommendation for her college application." Emma had been accepted to the State University's education program, with a full scholarship that would allow her to pursue her dream of becoming a teacher while raising Sophia. She had moved into transitional housing and was working part-time at a daycare center, building the kind of independent life that had seemed impossible when I first met her. "She didn't need to call you to thank me," I said. "I was honored to write it. She's going to be an excellent teacher." "She also told me something else," Lucas said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "She said that when she first met you, You were the saddest person she had ever seen, that you looked like someone who had forgotten she had value. Benjamin had moved on from the cow and was now making elaborate monster noises at a picture of a friendly dragon. I kissed the top of his head, marveling at how naturally affection flowed between us. She said watching you transform over the past year and a half was like watching someone come back to life, Lucas continued. She said you taught her that strength wasn't about never falling down. It was about getting back up and building something better from the pieces. I felt tears prick at my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. Emma gave me more than I ever gave her, I said honestly. She and Sophia reminded me that love doesn't have to be earned or negotiated. Sometimes it's just freely given, like the love you gave me, Lucas said quietly. All those years when I didn't appreciate it, didn't deserve it, didn't even acknowledge it, you kept loving me anyway. Benjamin had finished with his book and was now climbing down from my lap to investigate a toy truck that Lucas had brought over. We watched him in comfortable silence, both understanding that we were witnessing something precious. A child who felt completely safe and loved, who knew without question that the adults in his life would protect and nurture him. I got another letter from Isabella's lawyer yesterday, Lucas said eventually. Oh? I kept my voice neutral, though I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came with any mention of Isabella's ongoing attempts to disrupt our lives. She wants to revisit the custody arrangement, claims that Benjamin is being exposed to inappropriate influences because he spends time here. The old me would have panicked, would have started planning ways to make myself more acceptable, would have worried that loving my grandson too freely was somehow wrong. But the woman I had become just felt a weary irritation. And what did your lawyer say? That Isabella's attempts to alienate Benjamin from his paternal family are being well documented, and that every frivolous motion she files actually strengthens our case. Lucas smiled grimly. Turns out judges don't appreciate it when one parent tries to use a child as a weapon against the other parent's family. Benjamin had discovered that his toy truck made noise when he pushed a button, and was delighted with this revelation. His squeals of joy filled my apartment, mixing with the sound of Sunday morning traffic and the distant church bells that marked the passage of peaceful time. You know what the strangest thing is? Lucas said, watching his son with obvious love. I'm happier now than I was during my entire marriage, even with the divorce stress, even with the custody battles, even with all the uncertainty about the future. I'm happier because you're living authentically, I said, because you're not pretending to be someone you're not anymore. Because I have my family back, he corrected. Because Benjamin gets to know his grandmother the way I got to know mine. Because I don't have to choose between loving you and loving him. My mother had died when Lucas was 12, but she had been a constant presence in his childhood, baking cookies, telling stories, providing the kind of unconditional acceptance that grandmothers specialize in. I had always imagined that Benjamin would have that same experience with me, but Isabella had stolen those dreams for the first year of his life. Now, watching him play contentedly in my living room, knowing that this wasn't a special occasion, but just ordinary Sunday life, I felt the deep satisfaction of justice finally served. Not the dramatic, vengeful justice of movies, but the quiet restoration of what should have been all along. I need to tell you something too, I said. Patricia offered me a full-time position at the shelter, program coordinator. It would mean organizing volunteers, managing donations, helping develop new services for the women and children. Lucas looked up with genuine excitement. Mom, that's wonderful. You'd be perfect for that job. Are you going to take it? I had been thinking about the offer for weeks, weighing the security of a steady income against the freedom of my current part-time arrangement. But what really held me back was the old habit of making decisions based on other people's needs, rather than my own desires. I want to, I admitted. The work feels important. The women there, they need advocates, not just temporary help. And I have skills now that I didn't know I had. Then you should absolutely do it, Lucas said firmly. Benjamin and I will work around your schedule. We want you to be happy, not just available. The words were simple, but they carried a weight of respect that I had almost forgotten was possible. Lucas wasn't asking me to rearrange my life to accommodate his needs. He was encouraging me to build the life I wanted, and promising to support it. Benjamin had abandoned his truck and was now attempting to climb onto the couch where Lucas was sitting. I watched my son lift his son with gentle hands, settling him between us so that Benjamin could continue playing while remaining close to both of us. "There's something else," I said. "Emma's graduation is next month. I was hoping, would you and Benjamin like to come with me? She doesn't have family there, and I know she'd love to meet you both." "Of course," Lucas said without hesitation. "I'd like to meet the woman who helped bring my mother back to life." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, Benjamin content between us, the afternoon light streaming through my windows and illuminating a scene that was perfectly ordinary and perfectly precious. This was what I had lost and found again, not just my relationship with Lucas, but the simple pleasure of being a grandmother who was wanted rather than tolerated. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Sophia took 3 steps today. Wish you could have seen it." Attached was a video of Sophia's wobbling progress across her tiny apartment, with Emma's voice full of pride and excitement in the background. I showed the video to Lucas, who watched with the kind of attention that people give to things they understand are important. When it ended, he looked at me with something that might have been awe. "You did this," he said. "You helped her build this life. You gave her the confidence to believe she could do it." "She did the work," I corrected. "I just believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself." "Like you believed in me," Lucas said softly. "Even when I gave you every reason not to." Benjamin had grown sleepy against Lucas's chest, his eyelids heavy with the satisfied exhaustion of a child who had played hard and felt completely secure. Soon Lucas would take him home to their apartment, a small but cheerful place where Benjamin had his own room, and Lucas was learning to be a single father. But for now, we sat together in my living room, 3 generations connected by love that had survived betrayal, abandonment, and deliberate sabotage. I thought about the woman I had been 2 years ago, desperate, invisible, willing to accept crumbs of affection from people who should have been grateful for my love. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who knew her worth and demanded that others recognize it too. Someone who could offer love freely without losing herself in the process. Someone who had learned that the most powerful thing you can teach people is how to treat you. "I love you, Mom," Lucas said quietly, adjusting Benjamin's sleeping form against his shoulder. "I love you, and I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry it took me so long to remember what you mean to me." "I love you too," I replied, and meant it in ways that encompassed forgiveness and hope, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving the worst thing you can imagine and discovering you're stronger than you knew. Outside, the world continued its complicated dance of relationships forming and breaking, of people hurting and healing, of families destroyed and rebuilt. But inside my small apartment, justice had been served in the quietest possible way, through a grandmother's right to love her grandson, a son's recognition of his mother's worth, and a woman's discovery that she had never needed anyone else's permission to value herself. As I watched Benjamin sleep in his father's arms, I understood that this was what victory looked like. Not dramatic vindication or public apologies, but Sunday mornings filled with love freely given and gratefully received. I had learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming someone worth coming back to.